I finally got it.
Everything started to flow.
I felt it in my gut.
It was as though a light went on.
It was a total aha moment.
How do we know what we know? Scientists uncover facts. Nature imparts wisdom. Storytellers weave our shared narrative, while contemplatives seek inner knowing. All that we know is imbued with imagination, and our understanding is ever emerging. Welcome to Knowing, a podcast that explores the synthesis of knowledge, illuminating creativity and insight.
If you want to share your creativity and ideas, show your sorrow, or spread joy, or revel in silliness, you really need to do so in this third space because it's the only space where you can reach others outside of your own box. It's not like a gallery or a friend's house or your cubicle where people go to behave by the rules in like a 10 by 10 box. It's a in-between space where people are having their own thoughts and free to discover and stumble and explore and really experience life.
So Wendy, how's your third space life been this summer?
Well, I've been traveling. So I've been in airports, cafes, and parks in a few different cities. And I spent most of my summer in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I joined the swim club, which is a hotel pool. And I spent many days working poolside.
Nice.
Yeah, it was great. Santa Fe also has 2 or more outdoor public plazas that are vibrant and booked with live music and performance. So my third space reality is pretty good right now.
I think we should take a moment to define this term for our listeners.
In simple terms, home is first space, work is second space. So it's where we meet outside of those two that's considered to be third space.
Right. It's the public house or the bar or saloon.
Places we wait online, the post office, or get stuck at the airport gate killing time.
Or the public library or parks.
Online forums, campuses.
So many.
Yeah, there's tons.
I like the definition by the urban geographer and theorist Edward Soja. In his definition, he wrote about it 10 years after Oldenburg. Soja defines third space as a space of complete radical openness. And I love this part, free from conflicts of race, gender, class, sexuality, age, country, religion, nature, empire, and colonialism.
When I hear that definition, which I also love, I'm like, we've never even had that.
I know.
That's never existed.
That's elusive. It's a grandiose idea. It's great.
So third space, as you can hear, is really different from all the other spaces. Visiting an airport, we behave differently. So in the airport, many times I have asked a total stranger sitting next to me, can you watch my stuff for a few minutes while I go get a drink or go to the restroom? And other people do this all the time. And at the pool all summer long, I would hear someone say, I'm out of sunblock. And 2 people would start talking about it. And someone on the other side of the pool would yell, oh, here, I have some. Like, we become a little closer to family in third space. There's more intimacy.
There's so many interesting examples of us using third space. I love the one of the black barbershops, where mainly men hang out, sometimes daily, just hanging out together, building a rich social fabric, sharing information, friendship, creating community. Recognizing that this network had already been established, in 2006, Dr. Bill Relaford linked 850 barbershops to create Black Barbershop Health Outreach Program, which used third space to address health disparities in African American men. The initiative began by screening men for diabetes and high blood pressure, and the network was used during the pandemic to inform men to get access for vaccines and testing, and is still functioning today.
Yeah, that's a really smart use of third space. You mentioned 850 barbershops.
Yeah.
That's quite a network. In India, in Lodi Gardens and Delhi parks in Mumbai, it's not uncommon to see astrologers, palm readers, fortune tellers offering services in public parks. This is just a reflection of their culture, where they're deeply rooted in these religious traditions where astrology holds an important role. People get advice from astrologers about marriage and business ventures, but an interesting use of third space. Rob, do you remember when you and I wandered through a park in Chinatown in New York?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, on one side, there were men playing a betting game, probably 36 men. It was really vibrant and loud and active. And some people were playing chess. And then, like, 50 feet away, we walk onto this pagoda. And remember, there were, like, just couples, like, gracefully, sweetly dancing to classical Chinese music.
Yeah, they were having a little dance lesson. And those guys that were playing the cards, they had, like, wads full of cash and cigars in their mouth. And they were yelling at each other and laughing. And it was great.
It was great.
There's a number of factors that shape how our third spaces come into being. And those factors include city planning.
And now technology.
Right.
And one of our guests today on the show is a future planner. She'll speak to technology's influence in future third space.
Money also plays a significant role. How much tax dollars do we allocate for making third spaces effective?
And then there's law. Ordinance, restrictions that can either encourage or restrict our usage of third space. I pulled a quote from Christopher Alexander, who authored the Pattern Language book. He said, "Things that are done locally by people themselves with love will inevitably be better, more vibrant, and more attuned to human needs than things done remotely by distant bureaucracies." So he really feels that third space should be locally shaped and maintained, and that this fosters a more vibrant, human-centered environment that's really attuned to us.
That makes sense to me. Two of our guests today produce and participate in design projects for community participation in third space. They share on-the-ground experiences of bumping into law enforcement and bureaucracy, and they also speak to city planning from the perspective of re-inhabiting dead spaces in our cities and introducing interactive art projects.
On today's show, I'll talk with two of them. Jacqueline Atkinson is a multidisciplinary creative artist and producer whose work focuses on safe space creation, the exploration of interstitial spaces and ideas, bringing whimsy and greater meaning through impactful designed experiences. So we're talking street theater, performance art.
Yeah.
So we discuss her projects as one of the members of they call them the Six, who develop participatory experiences within these interstitial areas of the urban landscape. They're called Shadow Traffic, and they create productions that look like intimate gatherings, explosive celebrations, decentralized renegade events in underutilized corners of mapped constructs, spaces they can activate as a temporary autonomous zone available to the public to engage in.
Nice.
Yeah. And then I also talked to my old friend Splinter, aka Mark Harder. He's a record producer and audio engineer and someone who's been involved in like every performance art, street theater, flash mob, activism project that I could think of. He's like that guy. Like when you go to a project like this, you know you're going to see Splinter probably dressed as a tulip or a Santa.
Nice.
So, Rob, you chatted with a curator of Third Space. Tell me about Rick.
Yeah, right here in our own town lives Rick Dumiak, who drove cab in the disco era of New York City in the 70s. And he shares with us his experience of third space from inside of a cab and what interesting, intimate interactions can occur in that space.
Interesting. Well, let's get into some of the influencing factors. We mentioned that taxes and funding played a role in how our third space is available to us. So tell me what you found.
Yeah, if you listened to our Future Joy episode, you might have heard us briefly discuss the World Happiness Report, which suggests that populations of a country are more happy generally when there's less things to worry about. I know, which seems like, whoa, that's revolutionary, right? But it makes good sense. You know, people in Paris, France, and in Norway generally pay higher taxes than Americans do in their countries, but they get more extensive social welfare systems. If you want to get numerical about it, you know, the marginal tax rate in France, the top rate is 45%, and in Norway, even higher, 46.4%. By contrast, the U.S. has a top federal income tax rate of 37%, lower Social Security contributions, no national value-added tax, no wealth tax, and no national health care.
So basically, we pay fewer taxes, but we really receive fewer public services compared to citizens in France and Norway.
We pay it one way or another.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Just step onto the street in those countries and you see the money going to third space, these rich cultural centers that are well gardened and clean, fountains. In contrast, in our country, where we at times have social unrest that is met by changes in the landscape of third space, I saw an example when I went to university in Buffalo where there had been riots in the 60s. And when they built a new campus, they remembered those riots and they built third space intentionally to discourage congregating.
Oh, no.
Which I would say is the wrong approach to the problem.
Yeah, I mean, we have a situation where public land and public spaces are shrinking. Now, this is partly due to the hunger for capital fueling further development. Investors are seeking money to produce assets that gobble up third space in favor of private property.
It's a tug of war.
It becomes a tug of war, yeah. We have to make choices. How much do we infuse third space with money, taxes, and the allocation of financial resources? And we've all heard stories about communities coming together to protect their access to a green space.
Reverend Billy,
Yeah,
remember?
to save a park and then go hug those trees and save a park in their neighborhood because they want to put up commercial buildings or whatever.
Totally. I heard a story by a person who has leads art retreats in Venice, Italy. And she was telling me that over the years, it's gotten so quiet on the streets in Venice. People question, am I safe? There's no one out. There's no people. And it's the byproduct of people with wealth purchasing up all the homes just to sit on them as investments and kind of beat the interest rates. Yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing that in our country too, for sure.
So let's go to technology. We have a great guest on today's show, Jen Stein, and she's a designer and researcher in the field of speculative design and future-facing world building. So this is a really cool area. She designs practical applications for new kinds of user experiences, user, that's us, within increasingly complex systems. So she works on things like future mobility, the future of sustainable cities, the future of work, and she speaks about this at length on the show, augmented reality, virtual and extended reality. So we talk about stuff like parks reading our wearables and, how our phone is reading data to the environment. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
In this segment of the show, we'll learn about how future designers are planning for the implementation of technology in our third spaces. There's also, Rob, the atrophy of our willingness to inhabit third space. And in my conversation with Jacqueline, she really speaks to how we bring our online reality into third space. Like we take the subway to get to work, but we're sitting on our phone and blocking out the experience that we could have. So I think what's lost there is like chance encounter and play and adventure.
That keeps coming up, doesn't it? The relationship between technology and like everything.
So, and everything, yeah.
So, folks, today we're going to start the show in the backseat of a cab talking to Rick Dumiak. As I mentioned, he was a driver in New York City in that fun era of the 70s.
The disco era.
Yeah.
Boo!
Then we're going to step out of the cab and into the public square where we'll speak with the guest Wendy mentioned, Jacqueline Atkinson, who's in the group Shadow Traffic, and Splinter, who's basically in every group in New York City, who are using third spaces in wildly creative ways.
And then on to the future. We'll look at the technology planned for in our future third spaces. Jen Stein will talk about augmented realities and algorithms embed in third space, framing issues of security, privacy, and the energy needed to drive it.
Okay, folks, let's take a drive together from the analog environment of the cab to the augmented reality of future third space.
Where are you going?
You ready?
Sure, why not?
All right, well, I'm here just enjoying an iced tea with my friend Rick Dumiak.
Greetings,
who-
all.
Here in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico at Taproot Studios. It's not often we get to interview here in studio, so this is kind of fun. Rick, welcome to Knowing.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, you've done a lot of things in your life, Rick, but the specific reason we brought you here today is to talk about one particular chapter, and that was when you were a cab driver in New York City. What years were you doing that?
I drove from 1974 to 1976.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. I graduated high school in 72 and went cross country for a while, all over on a motorcycle, cruised, and got back in New York and started driving a hack.
Yeah. We were trying to okay, what era was he there? Was it the Wall Street era of the 80s or was it the disco era? It sounds like disco.
It was the 70s, discos. Oh, yeah. Everything was happening.
Cool.
It was a fun time in New York.
I bet. Okay, so I'm a customer on the curb in New York City. I'm getting in your cab. What do you say to me as I get in? Do it just like you would do it.
Where are you going?
Where are you going? Okay.
That's all I want to know.
I recently was in New York for the first time. I just noticed that they have a really strong sense of third space. In other words, they're like playing cards and chess in the park, and they have a real sense of communal space. It's probably because everybody's apartment's the size of a postage stamp.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Growing up in New York, I mean, you know your neighbors. You go to dinner all the time. As a kid, our parents rotated dinners. So, it's easier to feed, 5 or 6 together one night than 1 or 2 the other night. Yeah. So I ate every kind of ethnic food imaginable. I grew up in an apartment building in New York, and you pick the ethnicity, they were there. So from Chinese to Indian to Greek to, I don't care. I ate it. It was great.
Yeah. that sounds
multicultural.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Now being in a food desert, that sounds amazing.
Exactly.
How does that sense of community extend to the interior of a cab?
Well, I akin it to being a bartender. You're a psychologist. You learn a lot in a very short time about people. Mm-hmm. You got to pick up on cues real fast. Sometimes they don't want to say anything. Sometimes you'll have a life story in 5 minutes. You'll learn what they're going through, whether they're depressed, that they're happy, or the greatest thing in the world just happened, or the worst thing in the world just happened. Mm-hmm. I mean, you learn a lot really, really fast.
Do you think that the cultural reality of New York City influences that third space aspect of a cab? I mean, how does it express itself? Is the cab experience in New York City unique because that sense of community space is so strong?
New York is kind of unique in that regard, in that when you grow up in such close proximity to people, whether it's in your apartment or your building or just walking around, there's so much going on. It's 24/7. You tend to be more outgoing. Everyone says New Yorkers are cold and they're not nice, but I've felt just the opposite. Growing up there, I know so many people still to this day that I'm in touch with, that, I went to, 7th, 8th grade with. We're still friends. There's very much a family thing. And I think that's an East Coast thing compared to a West Coast. Mm-hmm. Having lived all over the country, I've been fortunate in that regard. To me, there's more of a family sense in New York than there is in anywhere else, especially once you get west of the Mississippi. I talk to friends out here and they'll have 1 or 2 friends from growing up. I got 30, 40, 50 friends from growing up. Yeah. Still to this day, we're in touch all the time.
It's really interesting because I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and having never been to New York, I had that same stereotypical impression that New York was kind of fast-paced and cold and brutal or whatever.
And it is.
And you see the movies and stuff. But when I went there, it was just the opposite. Yeah. If you looked confused and you were like trying to find your subway, somebody'd be like, "It's over there, honey."
Yeah. Yeah. No, people really are nice there. They are. Now, they're in a hurry, don't get me wrong. And they're not going to dilly-dally or screw around. And they're not looking for a life story. Yeah. But if you need help, they're going to help you.
Yeah. The cabbie, your role specifically, I think of other roles like the barber or the hairdresser, the bartender, the manicurist, massage therapist, etc., elevator operator. How might the third space of the cab be different than these other third spaces?
There's something about being inside a car with somebody. It feels contained or safe, where the other one's not. Like in a bar, there's all people around and everything. But generally in a cab, it was usually one-on-one. Yeah. And so the barriers break down real fast. Where you going, and hey, how's it going? Yeah. And that's going to determine the ride, whether they're going to talk to you or not. And I'm good either way. I don't care. I'm making a buck. So if there's a story to be told or heard, great. If not, move on to the next one.
Yeah. When you go to your hairdresser, you're going to go to him again in a month or 2. Right. But with a cabbie, you may never see him again. Do you think that makes people divulge things differently?
Yeah, without a doubt. No question. And especially, remember, back in the 70s, no cell phones, no nothing. None of the mass media that we've got today, or no Facebook, no anything. So a lot of times, people, when they want to get something out, it's easier to do it with a stranger than someone they know. Yeah. And what better place than in a cab? Again, you're contained, it's closed. You got a captive listener or audience, whatever you want. And you hear stuff, no doubt.
Do you have a story of something?
There were so many of them that none of them are really, One thing I learned is we're all the same. We all got the same problems. Because no matter how many people got in the car to tell me what their good story or their bad stories were, they're really similar to what I was going through. We're all in this together. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
We're one human race. I don't care what color you are, what ethnicity you are, anything. We all got the same problems. We're all going through the same shit. And so the cab was a really nice neutral ground. You know, at the end of the day, I think back on these stories and I was like, wow, that was really cool. Or man, I feel really bad for that person. I hope it works out. But it's the same thing we all go through.
Yeah. So you heard the good shit and the bad shit.
All of it.
Yeah.
All of it in between. You know, the divorce, the cheating husbands, I caught him doing this, or I caught her doing this, or she ripped me off. I mean, we're all going through it. And for some reason, the cab was definitely a neutral zone to spit it out.
Yeah. That's cool. How would you describe the dynamics of it? Are people more or less intimate, generous, sharing, combative, bold, honest, blunt, shy, trusting? Any of those things?
To be honest, it depended on the length of the ride.
Yeah.
Like some of my rides went from the county to the airport, a ride of about an hour, hour and a half. Let me tell you, you learned a lot about that person in that time, unless they were, you know, stuck in the newspaper or doing something, you know, work-wise. Again, no phones, nothing to do but sit there. So people opened up. And yeah, I mean, you hear the horrors and you hear it all. And part of that is a stranger, no question. They get out of that cab at the airport, they know they're never going to see you again.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, you know, that's a one-time encounter. I learned something, they learned something, or they let something off their chest, or I let something off my chest. Sometimes I was the one doing the talking also.
Yeah.
You know, it was a receptive ear, and that was kind of nice too. So yeah, it was a really interesting chapter of my life. I got to tell you, for 2 years, I learned a lot about people.
Nice. Any writer in particular that really impacted you, something that you took away from something they said or shared that you still carry with you?
You know, the only thing that really was memorable is I had one of the astronauts with me. I forget who it was, but it was one of the guys that was in the capsule when they did the first moonwalk.
Oh, wow.
Was in my cab. And that was really cool, hearing a perspective of somebody that went to the moon.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow. And that was a fairly long ride. It was about 30 minutes. And yeah, we had a great talk. It was awesome. You know, his perspective of looking down at Earth was something I'll never forget because, you know, he described it vividly and you could almost see it in your eyes. And, you know, I'm never going to get that opportunity. So it was really nice to hear it from someone that did.
Oh, yeah. I think that's called the overview effect. When you see the Earth from up above,
Yeah.
how it creates this sense of empathy towards humanity. It gives you a perspective that you just can't get any other way.
No doubt. Listening to him and the way he described it, you could tell the emotions in his voice, that it was something that changed him dramatically.
Yeah. Yeah. From your experience, what are the ingredients that set up a space to work well as a third space? Whether that's a cab or you said you've done some bartending.
Sure.
You know, what's the ingredient that makes people like want to be community, you know?
You know, some of it's the atmosphere, but in my opinion, 90% of it is whoever's starting that dialogue, if you will, or how they want it to be done. You know, I look around this room, it's a nice warm feeling. I feel good being here. I don't mind talking.
Yeah.
That's part of you though. It's not just the room. And that's why it doesn't really matter where it is, a bar, hairdresser, I don't care, out in the camping, wherever. If the tone of conversation is right, and if you are building a good rapport with someone, no problem. The words flow. But if you're not, yeah, people feel uncomfortable or anything else. So I guess the biggest thing is comfort is the number one thing. If they feel comfortable, they'll start talking. And then how you question or ask or respond determines where that conversation goes. Yeah, the third space, it's an interesting concept. I've never heard that said like that before, but I guess I've been in a lot of them. You know, I drove a dive boat for a long time. I lived on a boat. I've always interacted with people my whole life, and I've had a lot of careers.
Yeah.
And so cab driving was definitely one of the unique ones, but boy, some of the others have been just as interesting.
Sure. Okay, Rick, I'm getting out of your cab now.
All right.
And I'm heading to the airport. I just had that hour and a half long conversation where I probably divulged too much of myself. What do you say to me now?
Well, hey, I'll never see you again.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Enjoy your life. Take it easy.
You heard Jacqueline Atkinson just after the theme music. Now, here she is again. In this segment, she will discuss the nuts and bolts of being a coordinator for Third Space art projects in New York City. Later in the show, she will reappear, discussing the tension between actual human interaction and its technological replacements. and how much there is to gain by embracing the human need to gather. Here's Jacqueline.
When designing a third space project, we're thinking about utilizing the underutilized, about activating the places between or the places you might otherwise just walk by or through on your day-to-day, like dead-end streets or tunnels or blocks that are often just for utility vehicles and shipping trucks by day. It's for human connection in a city or world, really, of little boxes that are sort of meant to divide instead of collaborate. And I want people to stumble over on their way home or just because they happen to bike by and say, wow, I never thought about this as a gathering space, and to join in. We are 50-50 about whether or not we choose to produce with a license. It depends on the nature of the event, if it's utilizing during daytime hours or not. And our events with shadow traffic will sometimes get shut down, but we're often just told to move along to stop the spectacle. It sort of glitches out authority because it's such a gray area. Often we're utilizing public spaces, parks, waterfronts, streets, just not at the regular hours. So since nothing is bought or sold, there aren't tickets, quote unquote, or expectations. So it's often a little confounding to the police who is benefiting from this when the answer is actually everyone. Like, who's in charge? It's really hard to tell. Technically, we're not doing anything wrong. We're utilizing public space. We have a plan to shut down and to clean up and to leave no trace. Will likely sound indignant a bit to authority, but the limitation we run up against is often being too close to privately owned property, even if no one is around, even if it's a giant empty warehouse at night. That's, of course, somewhat the point. If we had space or property in which to gather, we could, but in the city, we don't. It's all private property. It's all for profit. But the human need to gather is integral, and we seek that connection and crave that space to be unlimited by finance and property value. Anything can happen, and often does, in this third space. It's whether it's just along your short commute, you might have many memories like, oh, this is where I received that breakup text. This is where I got chased for half a block because this guy thought I was taking a picture of his parrot. The third space brings variability, unknown, maybe danger or potential interaction, known or unknown, because not everyone is playing by the rules in your head. There is opportunity for connection and surprise.
Here is Wendy's conversation with Splinter, aka Mark Harder, regarding his participation in third space activities in New York City from the late 80s until the present.
Splinter! Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm very honored.
It's great to see you.
It's been years.
I know. All right, Splinter. So to contextualize this, you and I met in an atmosphere of rich third space. It was New York City around 2001 through about 2006. And we had flash mobs. We had the beginning of a Burning Man regional nonprofit. We had Rubulad and Madagascar Institute. And these groups were performing and developing street performances and surprise theater events in the public space. We had Reverend Billy. We had the Church of Stop Shopping. We had the Billionaires for Bush, SantaCon, Critical Mass. You were involved in so many of them. So tell me about how and why you grabbed hold and got involved in these projects and what kept you involved, because you're still involved.
People are using their life force, that energy that they have, that they're given by being alive, to participate in something with other people that matters to them and matters to the world, or at least you think it does.
It does to you in the moment.
Yeah, it does to you in the moment. And I love that you brought me onto this show to talk about this, because I got to do some self-introspection about moving to New York and getting involved in things. And when I moved to New York in 1989, I did it to get a job in a recording studio, in a gigantic recording studio, the Hit Factory. And that was what I was doing. That was where my life force, that was where my third space was at the time. I was giving everything to move to New York and make it.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept going and looking for more and looking for more. And I think that people come to these spaces when they're actually firing on all cylinders, making their engine come up with all this juice, all this energy, all this desire to find some place to put it and use it for good or for positiveness. And so I went from the studio work to the freelance work to the looking around for things. And then it, eventually the Burning Man world, which blew my mind like everyone else's the first time you go. And then you just start looking for things to do that allow you to be the creative person that you are. And that is how you feel when you're doing large projects. There's this project I was involved with called the Vomitorium. And the person who did that, I'm sure, when you get involved producing something, you are completely wrapped up in it.
Yeah.
And it fulfills you. And it's the thing that gives you joy and gives you the ability to deal with the subway being broken and crowded, and you don't have $5 today, but you'll have 10 tomorrow. And the search for feeling like you belong and that what you're doing matters is what got me to this kind of street work and meeting all these different groups. At that time, there were so many things going on. It was so rich.
Yeah.
I can help with that. I can help with that. I can help with that. And all of those things allowed me and allow others that I see the ability to do something that they really care about, that matters to them, and to stretch themselves.
Well, you mentioned Burning Man and having your mind blown the first year, which we all did. And then you come back, and in the way you were phrasing it, you come back with this realization of, I have this massive amount of creativity in me. And it's almost like we came back to New York and we were looking for a home for it.
Yeah, it's way bigger. There's more to do. And that was one of the things I think that helped open the eyes to Billionaires for Bush. And how could I help Billionaires for Bush? Well, I'm a recording engineer, and they wanted to do radio commercials. I did their radio commercials. Haha. So it's the ability to pull up these skills that you have that like maybe you don't use all the time, but you love to do, and
put them in a better context. Just recently, you were telling me you were a tulip. So what is it like for someone who lives in a city that doesn't have this kind of theatrical street performance in the third space to be involved in? What's happening there that's different?
I'll tell you about the first time I went to a SantaCon, maybe.
Sure.
It was hearing about it and learning I had to buy a Santa suit, and somebody knew where to get one for $8. So I had an $8 Santa suit, and you met, I think, Cooper Union, and everyone's wearing a Santa suit, and you realize that there's 4 people who worked together and came up with this idea, and they've printed out a booklet, and they tell you what we're doing is a treasure hunt in the East Village. And you didn't know this. All you knew was to put on a Santa suit. And then you get a number, and then you find other people with your number, and all of a sudden, like-minded people who wanted to wear a Santa suit and do something interesting are now met and are told to go find this list of things, which included a used condom and an unused condom, a comb with hair in it, all sorts of strange things that you were supposed to find. And so you were thrown into a unique situation with like-minded people and then told to go. And the experience that you had was what you made of it. All of a sudden you have 2 or 3 friends for life, and you're in the village, and you've got an excuse to ask people for weird stuff because you're wearing a Santa suit, and people haven't yet seen 10,000 people drunk running around as Santas. So when you get involved in one of these street things or a performance with a group, mostly it's you're like, I didn't think I was going to be performing, and now I'm on stage. Which can go from actually being on stage to standing in a protest with a group of people who are singers. But now all of a sudden, we're chanting the First Amendment at a row of police. So you get this emotional wash. It can go any which way, which is another allure of getting involved in these third spaces, because it's not your normal life. It gives you air. It gives you a chance to reach out and then come back to where you were. And by that way, you mentally create a bigger apartment in your head. Reverend Billy, we did all sorts of crazy actions. I went across the country with him. We were in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. No, Detroit. The Mall of America's in Detroit. And we were in red robes, and we'd just done a show, and we invited the audience to come with us. So these people had gone to a show. We grabbed them. They got on our bus. We gave them different colored robes. We got to the Mall of America, walked from one end of the mall to the center, where a group had just stopped performing. And there's this gorgeous atrium in the middle, all with red poinsettias and a piano. And there's nobody on the stage. And we just walk on like we were meant to be there. And people loved what we were doing until they heard the lyrics, which aren't dirty, but they're about stop shopping and why are you commodifying and, things like that.
Right. Death of the planet.
Yeah. So we were smiling, racial diversity all over the place, and we were having a great time, and there's like 5 stories of people looking down at us, and then the security came, and it was security force of like 25 or 30 gentlemen, all with very short hair, and finally something to do. And we finished the song and we got off the stage and we walked out of the thing, and they kept trying to ask Billy about what we were doing, and we just were singing songs and got out of there. So we went from like, are we really doing this, excitement, to we are doing this. Now I got to get my notes right, to, oh, what am I going to do if this goes bad, to let's get out of here. Oh, we're in the bus. Okay, let's go. All the emotions are there.
Sure.
When we did the somewhat same thing in Disneyland on Christmas Day, we had a meeting and we discussed how many people are willing to get arrested. And almost everyone did, but there's people who had green cards and people who are students from foreign countries who didn't want to get an entanglement if it went on long. So they had ways to bail out. They would take off their robes and just disappear. And they did, and it was fine.
Now, Cacophony Society is related to Survival Research Labs, and they were really kind of testing the boundaries of third space. Like, if this space belongs to us, if this bridge in San Francisco is the public's ownership, then you can't tell us how to use it, and we're going to go climb it and try to stop us. Like, they were really trying to point to, these are the limits set upon us, and we want to push back.
They did very famous shows in San Francisco where they had flaming things flying all over the place and burning things and robot smashing and machinery. And one of the funny things about the third space is you can be doing things and it seems completely normal to you. And people walk up to you, and like law enforcement walks up to you and say, what are you doing? Why are you standing next to that burning thing? And you're like, well, because we set it on fire and we don't want it to hurt anyone. So it seems really normal to us, but other people don't see it at all. In a way, you're doing what makes you feel good and gives you that juice, but you're also doing it so you can see other people either have wonderment or confusion.
Wonderment's both.
Like a wonderment one is taking the group the week before SantaCon happens, taking 5 Santas through the route that Santa's going to take and make it go through Harlem when it's snowing that day, and going over in front of a big window of like a children's store and hearing through the window in a snowstorm all the kids going, oh my God, look, screams, because there goes 5 Santas. And they're not all white guys. There's black people and women, and they're what is mind-blowing. It was super mind-blowing for those kids and super fun for us.
I know when I was in SantaCon, I always considered myself an elf, not Santa, but I had my Santa suit on that was elfish. And there was always a moment where I stopped pretending to be an elf and it came out of me. I was generating elf. I actually became an elf and I knew what to do. I knew how to be an elf.
That's great. That's wonderful. That's super character taking over. That's nice.
Oh,
Nice.
I fell in. In Madagascar, I'm thinking back to some of the performances they did where suddenly like a Broadway production is happening around you and people are just getting up. And, we're playing with these ideas. But for you, was it artivism? Was it activism? Was it anarchy, education, community bonding and development? Like, what's the keynotes for you?
It's a very good question. In a way, it's the community. As a musician who loved to be in a choir and play with a band and work together with people to make things happen, there are people who do not do things with other people. I've done this as a study with groups that I volunteer with or that I work with. I look around and I ask, who's a musician? Or who's played an instrument? Or who's a singer? And I end up realizing that everyone I got along with are people who are not loners. They're people who like to be in groups of people, who like other people. A band doesn't work if you don't agree that 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to do it again till we all really dig this. But there are people who don't have that, and I wish they did. And the sad thing about society is moving away from that, as everyone sits in texts and is in their own world space, and they have a hard time talking to other people. They're missing that working together. So for me, it wasn't that I wanted to go fix the world and have activism like first. It was more like the community of people who were doers. It was really the performing together and doing something with the group and building something.
There's always a few outliers, if you will, that are people who want what you're describing. I want to collaborate. I want to be part of something. I want to be creative in the context of a group. I'm not a loner, but my life didn't offer this to me before. Much like Burning Man. I mean, what do? We're making a statement about the world we wish to change by going in the desert and working harder than we ever have in our lives on our vacation time.
Cuckoo.
Right? So it just tells you something about us, to your point, which is that we really want to work. Work is not the problem. We just want to do it in a way that has meaning.
Yes.
I remember the Penguin and Chunk performance where two stuffed furry animals raced down Houston Street and Madagascar closed the road and a bunch of our friends got arrested, right? But the sidelines were the public and the public was all in. I don't know what the hell this is, but this is great. And then there were arrests. I'm curious to ask your opinion about what you think those arrests say about freedom to use our third spaces.
So those arrests were because police didn't understand at that time that people could go out in the street, take over for a while, and then walk away and just provide a show.
Right.
So the only weapon that like a politician had was the police. The police didn't have community outreach then. They saw these people doing this thing, and there's 500 people. You can't move them in a second. You can pick out a leader. You can arrest them. Once flash mobs became something that a mom in Ohio knew about, once it became known in the culture that this is a thing that could happen and not ruin anything and not make a politician not get voted in, I think that everyone took a collective breath and backed away from this brutal or hard only tool I have police response to street actions. The game of organizing something like this is now much more involved, and there are people doing it who actually speak with the police before they do them. And you have a talk with them about something that might happen. But now when there's like flash mobs happen, things are funny and cute, they make nice videos, they would go away. And my daughter was in a flash mob at school, so now I understand what these adults are doing. That police intervention has dwindled a lot. That doesn't mean that they don't arrest protesters at the US Open, where one of them glued his feet to the ground and they started talking about climate change. So they interrupted a match for like an hour. That activity was not meant to be pleasant. It's not meant to be funny. It's not an artistic thing. It's a political thing. It's a reaching out to the world saying, you guys understand that we need to make this message even more obvious for you all because you're not listening. So we're going to have to do louder and louder protests. And they waited to get a paramedic to find out if they could get his feet off the ground without ripping his skin off. So in the olden days, they would just rip our skin off. It'd still be on the light pole.
Yeah.
But it's changed because people have seen that you can do these kind of flash mobs or third space activation things, and people will enjoy them and they're interesting, and then they can walk away. And if they clean up after themselves and they do it again the next year, they really don't care. And then the third year they want to be a part of it.
Yeah. Third year they want to be a part of it. It's so true.
All these things started with two people. And then a third person. There's a really famous video of a guy who's dancing. By the end, he's got a mob of people dancing. That's the way these kind of things can be done wherever you are. Find someone like-minded, come up with a weird idea, do the weird idea, the two of you. You might find one other person who likes it. Then the next time you do it, you have three. It's always better to be there the first time it happens. Do not pass up the first time of anything. Always participate. Always go. It could be a failure. It could be the greatest thing that ever happened, and you get to say you were there first. And you also can get yourself in at a place where you might still have the ability to put your spin or whatever juice you have in yourself that you just want to get out there because it's something that's in you want to get out. I'm going to be the introvert leader of the extrovert club. And you'll find other people who want to do that. And, the extroverts will be like, well, we don't understand why they do that, but they come and have tea and watch us when we do our thing. Get active at the beginning. If nothing's happening around you, we're empowering you to go do it yourself.
When I first started talking to friends about, I think I want to produce a Roman vomitorium for the Republican National Convention, and I want the vomiting to be real. Everyone was like, you're never going to find people who want to do this. And now jump like 2 months, and I have more volunteers wanting to throw up in public than I even had a fetishy guy that I had to go shake off. But it was like, I'm in New York City. There's at least 50 people that'll agree on almost anything.
That is true. We're lucky about that in New York.
Our future designers and architects are planning futures that have augmented reality in them. It's an interesting future. It can support us. And then in a way, it's very security oriented. Your privacy is being invaded because you're being sort of counted and adapted to.
Philosophically, from my side, I think we were all put here to learn how to be amongst other people. And all of these things that we're doing to segment us away from each other don't help. Would I rather have augmented reality glasses where I could be walking in a square, boring, like green screen room and be in Paris with the sounds and the sights that engineers put together for me? Or would I rather be walking around Las Vegas and I want an augmented reality experience? So I walk into the Sphere, and the Sphere is a gigantic augmented reality space, but there's 1,000 people experiencing it with you. To me, a much richer experience, and something that can feed you and not just pacify you.
Well said. A lot of these architects and designers state that their first priority is to initiate play in those spaces through their technologies. And I find it very curious in the context of our conversation, because so much of the theatrical street performance stuff we were involved in was really about play. And I personally question, do people need a prompt? Because like those were prompts. We were giving the public prompts. You want to play with us? Come on, we'll show you how to play. I don't know. That's where my brain goes with the augmented reality. Like, really, do we need it? Maybe. And if we do, how are you going to prompt it?
In a way, the augmented reality or all of the gaming worlds that people do. Someone a couple of years ago explained Twitch to me, and I realized, oh, these gamers are not in their own world. They are following people. They have chat groups. They have ways of communicating with people all over the world about watching somebody play a game where they shoot people, or watching F1 racers race e-vehicles. That world is not as isolating as I'd once thought it to be.
And it is third space.
Absolutely. And there is interaction there, and you can be a quiet person, and also you get involved, and you could run a fan club for somebody. That gives me some hope that those things are not stunting people from being able to interact with others. There are still groups forming that are coming together. Shadow Traffic is a group in New York that is doing wonderful things, and lots of them. And they're very open to everyone being involved with them. They've taken over the Iditarod. They do competitive winter picnicking. They are younger, and they are doing a thing where they create third spaces all over. And once you get involved with them and stop just doing the events, their website says, feel free to steal an idea and do it yourself. No one's holding copyrights on them. The Iditarod is the thing that we heard about, and we did it in New York, and now we've passed on to other people who've run it, and all of these other things are available, and they're wonderful events.
The Creative Commons is a great way to hold a creative project so that everyone can copy and use it.
Yeah. I was brought to this idea when you told me about it just recently. So it's been in my brain, and I've been thinking about it, and it actually did lead to some soul searching. So thank you very much for including me. It's also really nice if what you're doing can get people somewhere who are like lost or don't have anything going on or nothing jives with them. If this could give them some hope to try to do something that lets them get their freak on, that makes them feel like they're living, then we would have won in great, great strides.
Especially post-COVID. You just got to push past a little hump there and then just get back out. And like you pointed out earlier, you're going to find 3 people, or when you're dancing alone, someone will jump on and it'll grow from there. Yeah. And it's fun as hell, Splinter. We
still
had
having
so
fun.
much fun.
Still loving doing it. Still doing things like that. Yeah. And if you're starting out, it's when the two of you are thinking you got to have everything dialed and have it perfect before you start. No, wrong.
Right. That's our corporate brain. Yeah.
Yeah, your corporate brain. And also growing up in the Midwest, where we would pick on each other incessantly if everything wasn't perfect. Don't listen to them. Just do it together. We're going to paint the fence pink, and we're going to do it from over here. And you show up that day with red paint and one brush, and you're by yourself, and you've got approval to do it from whoever. And that's half the fun. Just go out there and do it.
Yeah. Spontaneity.
And wonder.
And wonder, as you said. I appreciate this.
Thank you for thinking of me, and it was a wonderful talk.
Very much, Splinter. Thank you.
I'm afraid that people skipped the turning on and tuning in and went straight to the dropping out. And people are really so focused on their tiny universe, the size of their handheld device, Everyone's ready and equipped to tune out the environment around them in favor of the security and safety of their pre-programmed algorithms. And I think about the mandate at like immersive plays where you must put your phone in a lockable case or bag, and it demands your presence. And most people are really ghosting reality constantly, tuning out the adventure of the in-between, thinking it's just the commute. getting from point A to point B as unruffled as possible, as untouched on your journey as possible. But really, that is the journey, that is your mission. The invitation is there. It's a matter of breaking the programming and the algorithm. And that could be when you let your phone die, or it could be, being present and practicing mindfulness, noticing something new in these in-between spaces, or it could be a raucous spectacle that you encounter along the way that was not there yesterday and is a brand new experience. Self-expression is so necessary to the human experience. And I don't really believe that posting to your algorithm is doing anything but preaching to your own personal choir. And I'd like to encourage people to just tune in to their surroundings and to that in between. Make time for it and take a different route to work. Linger in a public park. Look at the water. Take an inspiration for being out of your box and actually talk to strangers. Like, what is possible here?
Welcome to the show, Jen Stein.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Can you fill us in on what is meant by design fiction and speculative design, and maybe frame the role they play in third space design?
I've been thinking about third spaces and third places in the realm of speculative design and design fiction as ways of imagining possible futures for places. The social, the cultural, the environmental, the economic, the political implications of the things that we design and put into the world. So a lot of my work has focused on these future states, what we might want in the future, and how to make those preferable futures, perhaps. The term design fiction comes from this hybridization of design thinking and science fiction. And this is a term that came from designer Julian Bleecker and design critic and science fiction writer Bruce Sterling, who had similar definitions of this practice of making artifacts that tell stories about possible futures. Whereas speculative design does the same thing in a way, but we often do a lot more critical thinking about what those designs that we're speculating about or thinking about might mean for the future. It's a way of asking what if questions. It's a way of trying to tell stories about these possible futures and about actually building physical prototypes that help us test those futures. Shows like Black Mirror is an excellent example. Something near enough that seems completely possible, but strange enough to make you question if that's really what we want. It's asking people, what if this, and asking for what they want to see in their own futures. And even though there have been times of polarization, people come together to think about these potentials. And even if you disagree, somebody else does agree.
So let's just take a moment and define what intelligent materials are and how they interact with interactive architecture.
They could be self-healing materials, biological materials, materials that can be embedded with sensors or change the way that light is used in a space. These sort of shape-changing alloys that have been used in public spaces to create more shade. They've been used on skins of buildings. When these materials warm, they can change shape. So they can create shade when there needs to be shade. They can create light when there's less heat or less light. We always say a building has character. What is a character if it's part of the building, but that it becomes an interactive or responsive character to you? It might teach you something about the building. It might teach you about how to more efficiently use the building. So I think the smart materials are part of how buildings begin to respond and interact given their environmental changes. I think we're going to see a lot more materials being developed that are responsive, that give us new ways of spaces responding to really rapidly changing needs in some places. Whereas interactive architecture is more about the sensors that are in that space or how we might come into conversation with a space.
There's a film I recently saw. It's about a man who I think lives in Japan and cleans toilets. Did you see it?
A Perfect Day.
Thank you. One of the things that stood out to me was the walls of the public restrooms, which go from clear to opaque.
A lot of interactive art installations use that kind of sensor technology or tracking technology so that a space kind of comes alive when somebody walks into it. At the time when I was doing my dissertation, it was the introduction of the iPhone, and we put these computers in our pockets, and we had a lot more computing power and a lot more connectivity to the world around us through certain sensor networks. I had the opportunity to move to Bristol. The Playable City group really focused on what does play mean in public space and who gets to play and what is accessibility in a city. So even if interactive architecture might think about buildings and these smart materials think about facades or buildings, or the toilets are a perfect example. And it was a beautiful film. The ways to sort of create enchanted experiences or something that makes you stop for a moment and think and see things differently. And I think that that's the powerful part of what interactive architecture or these kinds of responsive spaces can really be. Sometimes using city infrastructure is a great way to connect people who otherwise wouldn't talk to one another.
In what way does a space invite play?
I don't want to sound too much like the techno optimist because I understand there's several problems with our current state of technology. But I was up in Washington State for a conference, and it was the day after Pokemon Go launched.
Okay.
It's the first example of mobile-based augmented reality. It's a game on a phone where you just search for Pokemon. But there was a large park, and there was nobody in the park, and then there were hundreds of people in the park instantly, and they were all looking for the same thing. But it brought people together. They started talking. People sitting on the park benches were asking others what was going on. And then they started to sort of talk more to other people around them or sort of engage more with the people. There's certain kinds of opportunities for spontaneous gathering and play. This has always happened. You don't need a phone or a game to make that happen. There were the situationists back in the 60s, which really were about creating these instances that nobody realized what was going on until you were involved in it. You became this sort of player in a piece of immersive theater in a way that you didn't even know what was going to happen. So I think that's probably the best example of how spaces can become playful, even if you write on a wall, "This is a beach." And it's not, it's the middle of Paris.
Even in New York City, there was a time we had flash mobs and a lot of groups like Madagascar Institute. We did like on the street performances, where suddenly everyone around you gets up and is doing synchronized choreography.
Which is amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
and people just kind of go along with it, and they might feel like they never would have done that. And then they're caught up in it.
Yeah. So your work talks about possible and preferable futures. Is there a litmus test or some kind of baseline for this idea of what is preferable?
There's actually possible, probable, preferable. When we start with possible futures, we might go off on tangents, but we ask those what if questions. What if this? What if that? And then you think, okay, is that preferable? Who does that serve? Who is that bad for, even if you think it's good for somebody else? The preferable futures is the future that we want, not necessarily the future that we will get. And when we think about those possible futures, it can mean any number of things. We can still think through what could be possible, knowing what we know about the world and pushing that out 10, 20, 30 years.
So, technology moving front and center in our lives. And here we are, these organic creatures that's very essence is change, evolution, Darwinian evolution. What we do is change. We're sort of unpredictable. And then we have these terms for how that shows up, like punctuated equilibrium, black swan events, chaos. When we talk about expectations for our future and designing for them, how does randomness and this changeability get addressed?
That's when we introduce the wild card to the future. I've been doing this for a while, and we didn't think about a pandemic in any of our uncertainties, right?
Mm.
And that was kind of an obvious one. But there were a lot of people talking about futures that didn't think about what if the world shut down for 2 to 3 years, or what if the world fundamentally changed for 2 to 3 years. And I think that it's really important to talk about those black swan events or those wild card things that you don't necessarily want to introduce into this possible future. By talking about those things, you can also reverse engineer what you would do if those things happened. If you determine or if you define what the possible is, and then you look towards what you want, you use that as your starting point for design. There isn't the future. There are many possible futures.
What if aliens show up? Because that would be like taking the most ridiculous thing.
That is the most ridiculous thing. It often comes up as the thing that might actually unify everybody as a
I hear that all the time
because
too,
we're all in this very strange event that nobody has ever experienced.
There are no experts in the room on
Right.
that day.
Right. You've seen lots of science fiction about that. But you can, just talk through all of the possible, what would that mean from, safety and cultural and environmental and all different threads you can pull to talk through that.
On a side note, did you see the series Devs?
Oh, yes. So Alex Garland also made Ex Machina, Annihilation. I came to it just before starting to do some world building on a film about a near future AI.
Perfect.
It's just fascinating because it does talk about quantum computing and these things that are finally coming into the popular imagination, but are kind of still unknowns. Like we're making strides to better understand the possibilities, but I think the show is fantastic.
Algorithms want us to do one thing, like be consistent in who we say we are. There's this encouragement for us to be predictable, which doesn't include certain real human nature things like randomness and revolutionary thinking and wild creativity and epiphany and weirdness. Applying it to our conversation and wondering if technology is more embedded in our third space, will we be algorithmically influenced? And what might be some of the dangers that people in your field talk about around that?
It has been around a lot longer than we really talk about. Sort of CCTV surveillance cameras have been present for many, many years, and they have a way of algorithmically looking at where crime might be more likely to happen. And then there's extra policing there. More digital displays and more advertising, which we have seen in, some science fiction, is part of that sort of algorithm. And especially when you talk about personalization and how that's going to help make things more personalized to you, it is really about selling some things. There have been some excellent examples in design fiction and speculative design about how to avoid such systems. There's been some really innovative fashion, some really innovative makeup that completely throws off the camera. Computer vision can no longer read a face or a person given these pieces of clothing that you could wear or masks that you could put on. With all of the surveillance that we now know is around us and the algorithms that are making decisions, we become more creative about the way of obfuscating these technologies that are there. There's been a significant move, I think, towards the more than human world. And moving from human-centered design to life-centered design, there's people moving towards, you might have heard of forest bathing. It's about just going into nature and shutting everything off. And I think that the more that we're faced with these things, the more people start to push back and start to push into the sort of the natural world and move away from some of those things.
I mean, you can go to Tokyo and it's such a spectacle, and you're like inside the most fantastic pinball machine, and it's extremely impressive. But it's all the Pantone color wheel. It's all like the Mason's angles and all these basic, forms of measurement. And in nature, a new color green is emerging as we speak. There's this idea that the neural pathways we are, if it's just informed by the man-made, acculturated world, it's a very limited system compared to the system of the natural world, which is by definition unlimited.
A lot of computer systems and AI Learning models are based on neural networks on the human brain.
Mm.
At the same time, I think in the design world, we're looking a lot more towards biomimicry. And like you said, there's a new color green emerging. A lot of designers are looking at biomimetic systems, architecture or buildings or clothing that mimic nature. And there's some really super cool stuff that nature does, like chameleons blending in or an octopus that can hide itself. And that goes back to the sort of the surveillance camera and the sort of fashion around that is chameleon-like or octopus-like ability to not be
Mm-hmm.
seen. Thinking through systems, like mycelium networks and the Wood Wide Web, the redwood tree system, and how these systems communicate with one another and can tell about danger and can tell about contaminants and tell us also about the state of air and soil and drought. And if we start to look to biomimicry, but also the more than human world in our design of systems, then I think we'll be a lot better off, especially as we think more about regenerative systems and more sustainability in our systems, because we are failing.
Mm-hmm.
Climate change is pushing us to have to think of a whole new way
Yeah.
of designing for resiliency and for adaptability and for sustainability.
Going back to AI and also crypto, those are two great examples of very energy consumptive. I'm going to call them ideas because, in a way, they're not things, models, if you will, but we basically transfer the living natural world into death, if you will, for the sake of feeding energy to a system that doesn't regenerate or have any life of its own. Are we building things that require clean energy that we don't yet have?
We absolutely have to. Currently, the US is using 17% of its national energy daily on data centers for
Mm.
AI, for training foundational models. And they expect that to increase by 4 to 10% by 2030. The US infrastructure cannot handle that.
Mm.
Microsoft has made a deal to reopen 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania for their cloud computing and for their AI. And nuclear is a fairly clean energy source, but we're getting to that point where we have to really think about what the cleanest energy is, what new kinds of energy are going to be. It's so hard because the clean energies that we're using are still reliant on finding the minerals and the energy. So it's mineral extraction,
Or figuring out how to grab comets and all sorts of
asteroids.
things.
Yeah. Yeah. Or what's under the sea, which terrifies me because I'm a huge ocean lover.
Mm.
We're going to have to find new solutions if we're going to continue on this path. And I don't know how viable this current path is.
People who are really close to it say, if you had my vantage point, you'd know we can't not do this. I don't know if you know the work of the media theorist Doug Rushkoff, but he talked about it as trying to build a car that can outrun its own exhaust.
Right. And it's a double-edged sword because it is energy intensive and there are a lot of uncertainties right now, but the promises also for medical advancements or scientific research are amazing. Like the protein folding and unfolding that Google DeepMind did a few years ago.
Yeah.
People see the beating a chess champion or making a Gen AI image or asking ChatGPT something, but that's just the surface. I do think that there's a lot of great possibilities, especially around medical advancements and scientific research that will be really important.
I'm waiting for AI to hack into animal language and tell us what they're talking about.
AI is being used for that already. There are a number of people looking at specifically whales. This is such an anthropomorphic and human-centered way of looking at things, though, right? Like
Yeah.
we need to know what the animals are saying.
Did we forget that we know how to be and we're trying to meddle in a certain way with ourselves that might not even be necessary?
We know how to meet in public places. Wales has a policy called the Future Generations Act. in which every piece of policy put forward has to ensure a better future for the generation that comes next. I went through a number of communities throughout Wales. It was the first time people were seeing each other in public space again in the pandemic. And the thing that came up was building places for communities again. There's this moment where we were so disconnected from one another, and we were always on video screens if we had access to them. Kids were learning on screens. People were having happy hour on screens, and it felt very disconnected. It taught us that even in those spaces that we understand as third spaces or third places out in the world became dangerous from a pandemic perspective, and places that we couldn't necessarily utilize like we used to. We were asking about Wales in 2050, and a lot of it was about spaces for growing food together. What if vertical farming took over parking lots? Or what if there were better community spaces? And we might not have to over design the world, but there is something about demarcating spaces for community when people feel like they're not welcome or they're not able to use a space. And I think we're seeing more and more of these, you can't use this space. It's a blocked off space. You're not allowed in
private property. Yeah. There's no more roaming across someone's lawn. You can't do that. You'll get shot.
Right. It's about making those spaces available and feeling safe to use those spaces.
Just give us one crazy, wild example of what might be ahead.
I've been thinking about augmented reality. I see these really good things that could happen. You can learn about a history that no longer exists, or being able to point my phone at a plant and it'll tell me what it is. And I didn't know what that was before. But there's been a lot of work around how augmented reality could go terribly wrong from a privacy perspective. There's a really excellent design fiction film made by Kaiichi Matsuda, and it's called Hyperreality. And it was this day in the life of augmented reality. And even though I've designed these layers of possibilities, I still wonder what the world looks like or what happens when we don't have a shared layer anymore. I think that there's a wonder of discovering something with other people around you that you might not even know. And Snap had put a Jeff Koons balloon dog in the middle of Central Park. This is what augmented art could be. And within hours, people had figured out how to make augmented graffiti on the art. How do we push back against the things that we don't want? Balancing my sort of techno optimism with my, oh no, what are we doing? There are things that I think could be really playful and useful and informative in a way of creating community. We're so disconnected from reality and from the world around us. So how do you balance those?
Whose reality will I be living in? We have billionaires that have more wealth independently, privately than the GDP of nations. Am I in their reality, manipulated by their desire for my outcome? Or is there any kind of democracy around how reality gets formed?
And that takes people pushing back against what they don't want, even if for now that means going through the many layers of system preferences on your devices to make sure that you've turned off or opted out of all of the things that you don't want to share. Over the past few years, shared a lot of information for convenience because it felt like it was making our worlds better. And that there's a lot of privacy issues. You don't want to be fed information or have your information sold in that pursuit of convenience. Some people do. Yeah. I still turn off all of the cookie settings. And I design for some of these systems, and I still make the decision myself to turn it off.
In front of you are two parks with two entry gates, and one is unaffected by technology, and then the other has the best of today's embedded technologies. Which gate do you open?
I still probably open the technology gate to look behind the curtain. I still like the non-mediated world, but I'm always interested in what the system is that's being designed, and sometimes to just know how to not do it.
I think you might be human. Yeah.
Really? I passed the Are You a Robot test?
Yeah, it's some sort of version of the Turing test. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you just want to talk about or think is relevant?
As big as the world is, it can also feel a lot smaller when we're looking at our devices as we're walking through these spaces. Instead of just looking at the device and this mediated third space, how do you use those to reconnect and to create these playful opportunities or a situationist kind of event? Or the flash mob kind of intervention for theater or moments of togetherness. The third space has always been those spaces outside of home or work where you can build a community or you can see people that you don't know and maybe talk to them. A lot of that also got moved to digital space during the pandemic and continues to be. Technology has created different kinds of community for people who might not feel part of the communities that are available outside of our window. If there's this opportunity for a democratization of third space that you want to participate in, that's great.
Thanks so much for being on the show.
It was a really great conversation, so thank you again for having me.
Rob, have you heard of the term Seattle freeze?
I haven't.
It's the idea that everyone around you is having the same thought. If somebody wanted to be my friend, they would talk to me. And it started in Seattle, and I think because of their non-social third space, I suppose by naming it, it helped flip that dynamic a bit, like the culture bonded over the shared knowledge that they were in this phenomena together.
That's so sad.
I know.
What you're really speaking to, Wendy, is social isolation. And there's a couple authors that really carried this concept into modernity. Ray Oldenburg, in his book published in '89, The Great Good Place, where the term third space was coined. In this book, he describes locations where people can freely congregate, interact, and build community ties in a casual, welcoming environment. And then he warns against things like suburbanization of America, longer working hours, and the rise of television as reducing the role of third space in our everyday life. And then in 2000, along comes Robert Putnam and releases a groundbreaking book called Bowling Alone.
I heard about Bowling Alone.
Yeah. What's interesting about it is it came along during the dot-com boom era in the Clinton years. It's full of lots of facts and figures, but the basic gist of it is that we're becoming less social beings. Even then, before the internet was such a big deal, before social media, before the smartphone, he drills down to noticing that organizations like membership in the Elks Club or Lions Club or group sports or even playing cards. But most famously, he talks about bowling, obviously, hence the title, where the number of people bowling actually goes up, but membership in bowling leagues plummets.
Bowling Alone is a sad thought.
I know. I got my beer and my bowling ball. These two authors' work provide a framework for understanding the importance of human interaction in public spaces and the threats posed by modern social and technological trends. And just providing some ways to kind of revitalize those social spaces, those third spaces.
What were the ways that they suggested revitalization?
Join that bowling league and that parent-teacher conference, that Rotary Club, whatever it is. He just is encouraging social engagement.
Yeah.
You take these trends that they're both noticing in decline, you take all that and you pile on a worldwide pandemic, and here we are.
And technology.
Yeah, well, and as Rushkoff pointed out in our Connection, the Human Difference episode, that technology maybe even contribute to the feelings of isolation and division. You know, I don't want to sound like an old guy here, but, you know, like, oh, back in my day. But I do feel a pull to return to something.
What I'm hearing here is this progression of further separation. And it's why I asked Jacqueline the question of like, do we need a camp counselor? Do we need a producer in third space to activate it? And her and I agreed that right now we do. There's this idea I came across a while back called the tumbler. And I think it comes from the days of kings where a tumbler would be put intentionally, a person in third space, a charismatic, outgoing individual who stirs up energy, breaks the ice, and encourages people to engage with one another. So it's someone with unique ability to disrupt stagnant energy in a room. And the goal of a tumbler is to lead to better interaction and connection between people.
Yeah, I've known a few of those.
Yeah. Are you thinking of me?
I think what you're talking about is resuscitating an engine that's been shutting off since World War II. You know, with the
Right.
suburbanization of our cities, the rise of TV and tech and social media and all those things, it's time for a jump start.
Yeah, we need a jump start. Well, the thing that I see at great risk here is really trust when our third space atrophies like this. So if you think about it, it's where we learn to trust others. We go outside, we have chance encounters, and we discover there are people like us and there are people who are really not like us. But we also learn that in that field, it's okay. Everything's going to be all right. Back to Christopher Alexander's book, A Pattern Language. He wrote in it, people can only feel at home in places that are stable enough to allow them to shape the spaces to their needs. So that like our engagement in shaping our space requires that we first feel safe. But how do you have trust in a system that is tech derived?
Right.
Doug Rushkoff referred to it as the human difference. And Jen, in my interview with her, talks about future third spaces being designed through technologies that biomimic. So they mimic trees' root systems. They mimic the logic in human neural pathways, the Fibonacci sequence, and they inform intelligent materials to behave like the natural world, to turn on heat, to change the lighting, but doing it through tech. But I think what's astounding to me is we're essentially using technology to understand and interact with the natural world in ways that we had once been able to do quite naturally.
Yeah.
Humans can read the subtle clues and shifts in the natural environment. We can predict the weather changes. We can interpret the bird calls. We once knew the signs that were all around us. The signs are still there. And our sensory system and our nervous system are equipped for this and do it better than the technology that we're embedding into third space.
It seems like our history is a history of trying to work really hard to extinguish our own knowledge in some ways. I mean, we think about the indigenous people.
The savages.
We called them savages, but they were people who had sharpened senses for reading and interpreting the natural world. We've been trying to extinguish that since 1492, when Columbus arrived in the Bahamas and started enslaving and slaughtering the Arawaks. Our history is a story of abolishing natural skills and all those who practiced them in favor of being quote unquote civilized. Meanwhile, many people today think that civilization is the problem.
It's a weird transference of knowledge from natural knowledge to acculturated knowledge. It's like from living to dead. Has all this been just yet another pursuit of commodifying knowledge, just like we commodify everything in capital? Is it just capitalism again? I mean, punctuating this, Jen Stein points out that we don't have the energy for these future systems we're building that are meant to function in place of what our senses and nervous system used to do. And I think it begs the question, is it really wise to make our nervous systems obsolete so we can rely on an unsustainable replacement?
Even stranger that we're taking all of our regenerative energy and shoving all this energy, as Jen pointed out, 17% of our energy and on the rise.
Is feeding what, AI and crypto?
AI and crypto, yeah. We're replacing our natural ability to connect both to each other and to nature with these artificial versions of ourselves.
I mean, one has to wonder, what if we just stopped this and turned our attention to reskilling ourselves, reinvigorating our senses? I mean, we are built with this skill.
Yes.
Well, I was happy to hear several of our guests talk about the pushback. Jen reminded us that humans always push back. She herself modifies her smartphone settings to limit the intrusion. And she mentioned that Jeff Koons project in Central Park, where they put an augmented reality Jeff Koons balloon in Central Park. And it didn't take long before people figured out how to make it graffiti covered.
Yeah. Regarding that pushback that Jen referred to, where she's talking about we're building these systems of online surveillance, facial recognition in the public space, and then we build systems to not be seen.
Yeah.
Intelligent makeup, so the cameras don't read our faces. I find it fascinating that we build these technologies to connect, and then we build safeguards on top of that technology to protect us from that very technology. And people are making money off of each exchange. It's like bioengineering the plant that is resistant to Roundup and then making a stronger weed killer to kill that one. Where does it end? Remember what Rushkoff said? Snuggling is free. That's right.
Well, it gives me a little bit of comfort that this part of us, the part that fights back and always finds a crack to push through, is still alive. And I'm going to try not to let my algorithms squash that part of myself.
Me too.
We can push back a little further. There's the Situationists, which the Situationists were a movement of pushback, a social movement of revolutionaries made up of avant-garde artists, intellectuals, political theorists. Their ideas came primarily from libertarian Marxism and the avant-garde art movements of the early 20th century like Dada and Surrealism.
Situationist theory was an attempt to synthesize theoretical disciplines into a critique of mid-20th century advanced capitalism.
Central to their theory was the relevance of spectacle. So they emphasized the need for direct lived experience. They wanted to amplify the distortion of individual expression when it's moved through a proxy of consumption and commodification. They called this passive secondhand alienation, that was their term for it, which they felt inflicted damage both to the quality of our collective life and our individual lives. So there's Jacqueline's work, right? Shadow Traffic, and the projects that Splinter had been engaged in and is still engaged in. They're about spectacle, just like the Situationists, these constructed situations deliberately made for the purpose of reawakening and pursuing authentic desires, experiencing the feeling of life and adventure.
I can't say I disagree with the Situationists.
I think you are a situationist, Rob.
Maybe so. I hadn't heard that term until we did this project, but sometimes you discover, you read something like, wait a minute, that's me.
Whoa, yeah, I've had a couple of those. So where does this leave us, right? Like Splinter, back to him, he tells us, get involved, you'll find your commonality with others. Jacqueline also points to this with the Altar Project on the Lower East Side, where many artists set up a variety of altars for people to walk through. And she describes people's experience of it as, wow, we have all these unique worlds. All these different people are a world of their own. They're different and they're beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to the early part of the show, Rick, our New York cab driver, said something really poignant. One of the things he noticed is that we all have the same problems. He noticed the commonality. You think you're going to talk about this massive diversity, but what Rick noticed was how we're all the same.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, the stacking of all this, the history of our social atrophy, points to something really super important, especially in the time we're living in, which is the role that this plays on democracy.
Indeed. Let's circle back to Oldenburg and Putnam, because, of course, they were warning us against the social impact of it, but then they also went a step further and warned us about the threat to democracy, the polarization, the importance of civic engagement as part of what glues us together as a society.
Yeah, and it happens in the third space.
That's correct. Oldenburg points out and emphasizes that third spaces are important to democracy and civil life because they provide opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds to meet, exchange ideas, and form relationships. Now imagine if you have a Fox News bar on one corner of the street and a New York Times bar on the other corner of the street. That doesn't really work.
Yeah.
That keeps us siloed from each other.
Totally.
Putnam adds to this. The disengagement from community life and social fragmentation exacerbates issues like loneliness, political polarization, very interesting, and the weakening of democratic norms.
Yeah. So we do need the camp counselor. We do need the activator. Thank goodness for Jacqueline and her group, Shadow Traffic.
Yes.
It's really in the third space that we establish our trust. And as you mentioned, from Putnam and Oldenburg, develop that civic life, our civic engagement, and have discourse, which is necessary for a democracy to function.
So for next month, election month of November, we're going to do a show called Conjunction Junction.
What's your function?
Yeah. Wendy, we talk about flow state a lot, but I really see it here. Only in hindsight did we realize that we started this conversation in the connection episode with Rushkoff. We've continued it here in third space, and our next show leads us naturally to the importance of democracy and civic engagement. All of this is so umbilically tied together.
Yeah. And it came out of our gut. It just happened.
Yeah. I feel like we have a co-author in this, Wendy, and that is the universe.
Yeah, the fifth Beatle.
The third Beatle in our case.
The third Beatle. It's pretty magical. I mean, connection was the intimacy, like one to another, connect. And third space is really about connect to all the others. And if that works, and if you get the civic engagement back on track, then it leads to, November show, Conjunction Junction.
Yeah.
Civic engagement and democracy.
I'm excited about that. And guess what, folks? We're going to go to D.C.
We're going to be in D.C. for the day of the election results.
Yeah.
A block from Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah. Exciting.
Well, I found the show bringing me to the space of my imagination. I always like the notion, which I really believe, which is that everything that has ever come into being in this world was first imagined. So we must not undermine the value of having a robust imagination. I want to share a little bit of what I think beautiful third space would look like.
Please do.
So you and I live in a rural county in a downtown area that the downtown is creatives and the rural county is ranchers. And we live in the polarization I think a lot of our society and our country is feeling right now. And it's made me aware of a new reluctance I have, which is to look up in third space, to let myself meet the gaze of another. I've kind of learned to train myself not to express when I meet the face of another because I don't know who they are and I don't know what they think and feel, and I'm concerned about their intentions.
Yeah.
So when I imagine a beautiful third space, I imagine one where I can not only meet everyone's eye, but I can smile. I can engage in conversation easily with strangers, talk about what's on my mind. When I lived in New York City, sometimes this would happen. And sometimes I even found myself spending an afternoon with someone I just met and maybe even finding a lasting friendship. But I also imagine beauty, nature. And if tech's going to be there, appropriately placed. Like, okay, don't light the parks unless a person enters it. Don't heat the restroom until someone's in it. But I think there's a balance that has to be met for me.
Yeah, and don't put a advertising screen on my gas pump, please.
Please.
Okay, I'll share something I imagine maybe in the third space in the future. I imagine sitting down with a diverse and politically mixed group of friends and having a beer together, and maybe even talking politics without anything exploding. In my efforts to try to move in this direction, I befriended a woman at my escrow office that I go write a check to, who is my political polar opposite. We've become friends. We say hello when we bump into each other at the store. I imagine America where we can again have a big family Thanksgiving dinner without things getting weird. There's so much more that unites us than divides us. It depends on the wolf that you feed.
Love that. Well, I appreciate all our listeners for hanging out this long. It's a longer than usual show. I hope we left you with a feeling of possibility and hope and maybe a newly invigorated excitement about third space.
I agree. And this feels like the right show to end with this. Folks, stay friendly.
Talk to strangers.
And have fun out there.
There's so much going on in everyone's life, and just the general state of the world is so heavy that if I can bring the smallest bit of joy and surprise, like happy surprise into someone's life, that's genuinely what they might just need that day. Just a small pick-me-up, like a flower in a crack.
We are always delighted to receive feedback from our listeners. Email knowingpodcast@gmail.com and stay connected on Substack. Knowing is written, produced, and hosted by Wendy Tremaine and myself, Rob Stroop. Original music and sound design also by Rob Stroop. Recorded and produced at Taproot Studio, Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Knowing is a production of Chapter 24 Media. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your life. Take it easy.